I'll talk for a while and leave some time for your questions, and when I do turn to your comments and questions, feel free to ask about anything that's on your mind that you think I might address. But my purpose in my time is to try to take Osama Bin Laden as he lives in your imagination and in your understanding out of the cave in which you may have him located, and to try to bring him into the world that you share with him, the modern world that I think he's very much a part of. And in trying to draw him into the era of globalization and into the shared experiences that globalization has created, even between Lexington, Virginia, and Miran Shah, Pakistan, I think you have to go back and start a little bit at the beginning of where his identity arises from. But I just want to set my intentions by saying that I think for many of us, certainly for myself as a journalist, I wrote my first story about Osama Bin Laden in 1994, I think, when he was living in exile in Sudan, and I was a correspondent for the Washington Post. First World Trade Center bombing had occurred. My editor said, do something about transnational radical Islam in the Sunni world. I started poking around, heard about some rich kid who was living in Sudan, seemed to be funding terrorists, and I've been interested in him ever since and have followed him very closely. And I think during the first 10 years of my efforts to try to understand and describe him, I, like many people, emphasized that Osama was a product of the transnational Islamist radical movements that sprang up in the Middle East after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and that it was important to see him as a creature of this broader phenomenon of transnational Sunni radicalism in particular. And then also in Ghost Wars, I spent quite a lot of time and effort, because I had been a correspondent out in that region, and I had lived through quite a lot of the events that I tried to go back to as a sort of quasi-historian. There I tried to set Osama as a creature of the anti-Soviet wars in Afghanistan, the experiences he had on the frontier, the experiences of radicalization that deepened as he met volunteers from all over the Arab world to fight the apostate Soviet occupying army in Afghanistan. So those are the standard received versions of Osama Bin Laden, a creature of international Islamic radicalism, a creature of the Afghan wars, a man whose ideology looks backward to the 7th century and attempts to perfect human behavior today by imitating the imagined lifestyles that were prevalent in Arabia during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. So what am I arguing? All of those are valid ways to see Osama bin Laden. I continue to hold in my mind those interpretations of him. So I'm not repudiating them when I spend the next minutes trying to add to them an interpretation and an understanding of him that is really quite different and is not so commonplace in the West as we think, not only about Osama, but what's important is all of the people around him, the followers, the movement, the network that he represents. And locating that more in the modern era that has shaped our national experience was, to some extent, the purpose of writing the second volume, The Bin Ladens, about his family. You know, I had grown up reading books called The Kennedys or The Rockefellers, where writers would take a single family important to the political economy of the United States and through its multi-generational experiences illuminate something of the American experience. And it was my ambition with the Bin Ladens to do something similar about Saudi Arabia, and also, though, to reinterpret Osama as a member of his own family, and particularly as a member of the generation, the sort of baby boom generation in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, that came of age in the 1970s, in and around the 1970s, during the great oil boom. Now, this was a generation that had enormous privileges, especially if they were from business families or elite families such as the Bin Ladens. And young men and women like Osama, including his brothers and sisters, they had the wealth, suddenly, without preface, without preparation, to go out into the world, the wider world, and essentially purchase any identity that they wanted. And they also had the means to travel. The Bin Ladens were the first family, private family in Saudi Arabia to own an airplane. They bought their first one in the 1960s. During my research, I found at least 8 to 10 of Osama's brothers who were private pilots. The family, during most of his young adulthood, was run by his eldest brother, Osama Bin Laden, who was a pilot who had a fleet of Lear jets, Bach 111s, Hawkley Siddeley business aircraft. And he and his brothers flew all around the world. So they had this mobility. And as I say, they had the allowances, the stipends to go out and essentially purchase, discover, rent, invest in any identity that they wished. Now, Osama had 53 half-brothers and sisters. And if you think about that generation within the Bin Laden family and in Saudi Arabia more broadly, you can imagine the diversity of choices that those individuals walking through the same global supermarket might make. And in fact, in the Bin Laden family, the choices that individuals made, men and women, about who they were and how they related to the puritanical faith that they found at home in Saudi Arabia and how they related to the culture that they discovered on the streets of Paris or in the aircraft hangars in Texas where they hung out with fellow private pilots. Quite a lot of range of decisions. And Osama's personality, his ideology, his radicalization is inseparable, I think, from this process of search and choice and purchase, which was the experience of a particular generation in the Gulf that became suddenly wealthy without much preparation, as I say, for that wealth. So let's back up a little bit and place Osama in that context, in that narrative, and I'll give you an even more specific flavor of his experience. So Osama's father, the patriarch of the Bin Laden fortune, was a man named Mohammed Bin Laden. And he was born essentially an orphan in an area of southern Yemen called the Hadramaut, that at the time of his birth, around the beginning of the 20th century, was a famine-stricken, impoverished, and isolated backwater of the British Empire. It was notionally a part of the British Empire, but no Britons ever went up into the canyons where his family lived. As an orphan, he walked out of this environment, found his way to Jeddah, the gateway to Mecca, in the late 1920s. Now, he didn't just do this out of personal ambition. The Hadramis are well known in the Arab and Islamic world as a diaspora of ambitious, entrepreneurial, and talented people. They're as well known in the Islamic and Arab worlds as a special diaspora as the Jewish diaspora or the overseas Chinese are known in their own spheres. It's just that we don't know anything about them. But a Hadrami who walks out, even an orphan 14-year-old Hadrami like Osama's father, has connections. He has traders and cousins and uncles and friends who are going to take care of him and find him forward. And it was through that network, that self-conscious network, a kind of undergirding of the British Empire, about which the British were themselves largely unaware, that Mohammed found his way to Jeddah, arrived poor with his brother, his younger brother. They slept on the ground, they slept on the dirt, they carried bags for a living. The main economic activity in Jeddah at the time were pilgrims arriving for the Hajj. They would land at Jeddah and they would travel inland to Mecca. They needed hotels, they needed bag handlers, they needed temporary housing, and the economy around them was thriving in the 1920s. But when Osama's father arrived, then the Depression arrived, that suppressed the Hajj trade. Then the Second World War arrived, and that suppressed global travel even further. So Osama's father had to hustle his way forward and to imagine himself as capable of something more than just sleeping on the sand. And he taught himself to be a bricklayer, a small-time contractor. He got a job with the American-led oil consortium. They trained him as a formal bricklayer and as a team leader. And to make a longer story short, in the period after the Second World War, when oil boomed in Saudi Arabia, he made a great fortune as the most important indigenous construction magnate in the young Saudi kingdom, at a time when millions and millions of dollars were suddenly flowing into Saudi Arabia, and the royal family wanted to build largely palaces for themselves, eventually roads and hospitals and public buildings. Mohammed Bin Laden emerged as their favorite builder. And he built this great fortune not because he was an engineer with any formal training. He was illiterate, he had never been to formal schools. However, he had a terrific intuition about complex physical engineering problems that served him well. But more importantly, he succeeded because he had a gift for people. He had an intuition about how to manage up, how to make the royal family happy, and how to manage down, how to organize a very complicated, diverse labor force, swarm big problems like building a road through an impossible cliff, and motivate people from all over the world to get the job done. By the 1950s, when he started to build this family of 54 children, his company was populated by people from all over the world. His accountants were Americans. He had a procurement office on Broadway in New York. His engineers were Italian Catholics who flew in from Italy for 6 months at a time. Other accountants were from Beirut, from all over the Arab world. He had laborers not just from the Arab world, but also from Africa and from South Asia, Pakistanis, Indians, from Southeast Asia, from everywhere, because the Hajj brought people from all over the Islamic world, and some of them stayed and became involved in the building world. So this was the world in which Mohammed Bin Laden created this extraordinary family. Now, 54 children by 22 or 23 wives over the course of his lifetime. This was an example that was readily available to him in Arabia at the time. In the Yemen, where he had grown up as a boy, a big sheikh who made it big and came back to build a retirement home typically had 10 or 12 wives over the course of a lifetime. The Saudi kings, who he knew and served, were even more profligate. Abdulaziz, the founding king of modern Saudi Arabia, had certainly 60 acknowledged sons and many other unacknowledged children by concubines. His eldest son, Saud, who was prominent in Muhammad's lifetime when he started to make his money, is estimated to have married about 200 times. Now, Mohammed Bin Laden was a very pious man, but he was not a political man. And he did believe that he was, under Islamic law, entitled to marry multiple times. The way he organized his family was that he married early, when he first started to make money right after the Second World War, 2 or 3 senior wives to whom he remained married for his entire life. They lived with him on the compound. Each of them had 5 or 6 children. And then there were 1 or 2 positions of the 4 where he essentially rotated wives every 6 or 12 months. And there was a kind of transactional aspect of this. He would travel as a businessman into a new area where he was building a road and the local tribes might be hostile. He might take the daughter of a local sheikh in marriage and also then bring her brothers into the workforce to try to calm things down, get the local families invested in the project. Osama's mother, and it's often been said that perhaps Osama was radicalized because his mother was an outcast because she was of low birth, low status. In fact, his condition was entirely normal. And all of the wives that Muhammad married who bore him children were recognized by him as completely legitimate. And he tried to treat them according to the prescriptions of Islamic law. So when he divorced them, he made sure that they had means to live comfortably. And he recognized all of the children by even these shorter marriages as fully legitimate and entitled to their share under Islamic law of his considerable inheritance. Under Islamic law, there's a very complicated, very specific formula written down in the Quran about inheritance from which you cannot deviate. You cannot designate Washington and Lee as your beneficiary, except with a very particular set of trusts that the Quran prescribes. Otherwise, you've got to take care of your family, and there's a strict formula in which the sons get a full share and the daughters get a half share. And there are lots of other in-law formulas that are all written down. It took many hundreds of years to come up with this system. But Mohammed Bin Laden was very scrupulous about it, and every child that he had was fully invested as one of his heirs. So he was traveling in Syria in the mid-1950s as part of this acquiring materials for his building trade, and he met a family there, very poor, in a very secular area on the Mediterranean coast. And for reasons that nobody quite can identify, the family offered him their 14-year-old daughter in marriage. Now, he was a businessman at that time of probably 40 or 45 years old. And these seemed to be the kinds of transactions that he entered into. But as I say, if the young woman became pregnant, then he fully recognized their child as a legitimate heir and as part of his family. So he traveled with this Syrian woman to Riyadh, where he was working on construction projects. She became pregnant. And in January 1958, someone born in October 1958, this rings in my ears, Osama was born in Riyadh, the only child of this marriage. About a year later, Mohammed divorced Osama's mother, Now you can imagine she's many miles away from her family in Syria. She's still a child, essentially. She has a child in her arms. This much older man, with whom she could hardly have had a very well-developed relationship, has now repudiated her. But he has arranged for her remarriage to an executive in his own company, a mid-level executive who has a salary, and a rather comfortable salary. So she travels into this new marriage, burying the son from the old marriage, and ends up, as it turns out, forming a monogamous union with the man who is still alive as Osama's stepfather. And they live in a suburban house in Jeddah, coming of age in the late 1950s and then the 1960s and the 1970s. Well, imagine Osama's status in this household. He is literally the golden goose, because it is through his status as the legitimate son of Mohammed Bin Laden that he begins to receive allowances of several $100,000 tax-free dollars a year in the 1970s, which was real money. And it's through his legitimate status as a legitimate son of Mohammed, that his stepfather has employment, and his employment is assured. I mentioned that there's a kind of myth that Osama was an outcast. In fact, there were many other singleton children in Mohammed's universe who had very similar narratives as Osama's. Short-term mother, young mother, remarried to someone who had a job in the company. And the sons in particular were honored as they met with their father every weekend. He had them gather and recite verse to him, memorize verses of the Quran, travel into the desert. Like a lot of rich self-made men, he thought his sons were in danger of growing up too soft, so he made them go out in the desert and do a lot of exercises and sleep on the ground. He tried to keep their allowances as small as he could for as long as he could. He told them they needed to toughen up. He was very formal, very Arabian setting in which the boys would gather and recite. But as this family grew up and the sons went off to education, the father also understood that he was entering into a new era. And if his sons were going to succeed with the Saudi royal family the way he had succeeded, then his sons needed the kind of education that the sons of the princes were getting. They needed to go abroad. They needed a modern education. They needed an education in English. They needed an education in mathematics. So he sent many of his sons to boarding schools abroad, to a Quaker school in Beirut and to England. Osama went off to boarding school as a young boy, about 9, 10 years old, in Lebanon. It didn't take. He came back, reasons unclear. And he enrolled in the only modern day school in Jeddah, a school that had English and Irish teachers and computers and air conditioning, things that were pretty much unheard of in Saudi Arabia in the 1960s and early 1970s. It was a very modern curriculum, and it was there as a young man that he was preparing to join the modern world and become a young executive in his father's company. As I say, his father was a great traveler, and he had many aircraft. He flew around to his different projects. His pilots were all Americans. Many of them were Air Force veterans who had been seconded to him through contracts with TWA. And in September 1967, Mohammed Bin Laden got into one of his propeller planes, a twin-engine Beech aircraft, with an American pilot who had just joined him, veteran of U.S. Air Force, and they were flying down to a work site in southern Saudi Arabia, Nasir, and they were landing at a very difficult dirt strip just marked by stones in a bowl, kind of an awkward slope. And the pilot was coming in for a landing, and a crosswind came up, and the pilot decided that he needed to pull up and go around. And he pulled up and did so too abruptly, investigators later determined. And the plane stalled and crashed, and Mohammed Bin Laden died instantly in September of 1967. Now, when that happened, Osama Bin Laden and the pilot, of course, died with him, creating the first of a series of spectacular air events, air crashes involving Americans in the Bin Laden family life, not the last. When Mohammed Bin Laden died suddenly, Osama was about 10 years old. He had just come back to Jeddah from his failed attempts at boarding school. And the family was then taken over by Osama's eldest brother, Salam Bin Laden. At the time that the father died, Salam was in boarding school in London, outside of London, and he was playing in a rock and roll band called the Echoes. Now, one of the talented guitarists in that band ended up marrying Emmylou Harris. Salam was about 21 years old, and he is a character who's very difficult to describe briefly, but I'll attempt to do so. He flies back, his father's dead, he's 21, he's been in boarding school, preparing to take over the family business as the eldest son would. But he is a man with the same sense of charismatic genius that his father had, but he's applying it in a rather different direction than his father and as Osama will eventually. There's nothing that Salam loved more than rock and roll music and flying. He was a very skilled pilot and a very unskilled but enthusiastic musician. He surrounded himself, did any of you watch the show Entourage? So he essentially lived with an entourage of American and European rock and roll pilots who would fly around the world with him to ski resorts and to nightclub resorts, wherever they could. They moved around and across oceans the way you and I might cross town. They would get into one of these Lear jets that Salam maintained. At Jeddah, they'd fly quickly to Cairo. They'd party that night in Cairo. Then they'd fly to Paris. Then they'd fly to New York. Salam bought an apartment in Manhattan. He bought an estate outside of Disney World, one of his favorite places. He bought a lake house in Texas. He spent time trying to make movies in Hollywood. But his main thing that he loved was to perform, always to be in motion, but always to perform. And if he was here tonight, he would stand up on the stage and lead all of you in choruses of his favorite songs, which included On Top of Old Smoky, that was one of his favorites. She'll be coming round the mountain when she comes. He loved kind of corny folk songs, and he would go to parties. He once went to an Academy Award party, and the band was on the stage, and he would go up, and as he was always traveling with very large sums of money, he would peel out $100 bills and ask the band leader to stand down for a while, and he and his gang would stand up there, and the one song that they played just about everywhere was House of the Rising Sun, which he could sing badly, but he sang it very loudly. When he was flying, he would always get on the air traffic control radio with the controllers wherever he was coming in, and wherever country he was landing in, he would try to sing their national anthem or play it on the harmonica for them. He was somebody who around. He was essentially a very sweet-tempered, charismatic character, shrewd in business and effective in business, but he was a young man dealing with the CEOs of the largest corporations in the world who all wanted entry into Saudi Arabia and to the oil boom through the Bin Laden family. And he would keep them off balance, these older men with their considerable experience, by basically forcing them to come to his terms. So he would only hold business meetings while lying in bed in a hotel, or while in the middle of a party. Once the CEO of Bell Canada came in to sign what was going to be the largest telecommunications contract in the history of the Middle East, and he thought he was going to the final meeting to draft and sign the agreement. Instead, Salam invited him out to his house. There was a party of about this size, and he immediately insisted that the CEO lead 1/3 of the audience in the French portions of Frère Jacques for about 45 minutes. And at that point, the guy was so disoriented that basically Salam was able to kind of, and he had a very sort of American characteristics in some respects. He liked the freedom of travel, and he was very egalitarian. He really did not like people with social errors. And in Palm Beach, he hated, in Florida, he hated being in Palm Beach where a lot of the Saudi princes wanted to go. His favorite town in Florida was Panama City. I don't know if any of you know, but it's proudly known as the Redneck Riviera. And that was where the pilots that he loved were. That's where the rock and roll was, and the blues houses were, and that's where he preferred to be. And he basically, he'd get off a plane in the States and put on a t-shirt and jeans and drive around in a battered Volkswagen Rabbit. Loved to ski. He was also big on all of the technologies of globalization very early on, not just aircraft that smashed borders and time, but also telephones. He carried the first cell phones, this big old Motorola bricks. He'd carry them up on top of mountains and call all of his family members in Saudi Arabia and say, "You wouldn't believe I'm in Aspen skiing." But he had a sense of the world as being borderless. That was very much a part of what he instructed all of his brothers and sisters in. And he was very supportive of his sisters. He trained a number of his sisters to become pilots, become medical doctors. At his insistence, they sometimes took these graduate courses, even though they really didn't want to be pilots or medical doctors in some cases, and then they became flourishing professionals. So this was really the family that Osama knew growing up. Now, why did he turn out the way he did, given that this was really the ethos of his generation in the family. And so many of his brothers and sisters, in one way or another, participated in the culture that Solomon created. Well, at this prep school back to Chile, where the English and Irishmen are teaching English language classes, and there's a computer lab in the back, there were also teachers from Syria and Egypt who had arrived in Saudi Arabia in the early 1960s, 1950s as exiles from Nasser, and who were members of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a transnational Islamist preaching and at sometimes and political network, both violent and non-violent characteristics. Hamas is essentially the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine, and of course you've heard about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt as a sometimes revolutionary and sometimes pacified political force. But these exiles from Syria and Egypt were teachers in many cases, and they were recruiters as well and proselytizers, and they believed strongly in the political vision of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Syrians in particular were engaged in revolutionary activity back home. Typical Muslim Brotherhood recruiting strategy is to identify the sons of elite families and to try to bring them in through intensive study and one-on-one preaching and political education. And it was the Syrian gym teacher at this prep school who formed an after-school study group and picked Osama as a star student from an elite family to join the study group. And there after school, at age 14, fatherless, in an environment where he's living at home in this fairly middle class and ordinary nuclear step family, but still not quite of it. This father figure, the Syrian gym teacher, indoctrinates him and fully enlists him at age 16 or 17 in the Muslim Brotherhood. And really, one of the characteristics of Osama is he's a very stubborn character. And I think any biographer would have to say that at the moment that he entered the international Islamist world through this recruitment and 2 or 3 year indoctrination as a young man, he never really left it. He went through various doctrinal arguments with his colleagues, and he broke with the Muslim Brotherhood eventually, but he stayed inside the stream that he was recruited into as an adolescent, and he never really deviated from it. Now, being religious and being even ardently religious and being even kind of a nudge within his own family was not an act of radical rejection in Saudi Arabia, or even within the Bin Laden family. In Saudi Arabia, such a belief system and such a way of living was in fact quite orthodox. And the Bin Laden family, even though Solomon was quite radically irreligious among his brothers and sisters, to the point where they used to tease him, "You're going to hell, don't make us bring you pork during Ramadan, stop eating and smoking during the fast." Many of the rest of his brothers and sisters, though they respected and loved Solomon, they nonetheless made different choices, more centrist choices, where they were pious in their personal conduct and tried to live properly, but they were also comfortable in the West and business people who traveled abroad and took pleasure in the West without becoming Western. And there were others in the family, still others, the far right wing of this kind of coalition of cultural identities, each available for purchase with these allowances, to which Osama belonged. He was not alone over in that grouping within the family, and he was distinctive, and to some extent, he provided credit to the Bin Laden family with the Saudi religious establishment. Whenever someone who knew Solomon might wonder whether the Bin Ladens were really one of us, well, they could always send Osama to the meeting, and he would really demonstrate that he was of Saudi culture and comfortable with Saudi culture. And he became a junior executive in the company after he started studying business administration at university. He had some project jobs. It seems likely that he traveled to Chicago at one point to recruit engineers to the family. I certainly have him documented in Egypt. He traveled to London for medical reasons and I think also for business reasons during these years. He was a man of the world. He was not isolated. Yes, he was personally pious. Yes, he married young. Yes, he followed the precepts of the Muslim Brotherhood. But he was comfortable in the wider world. He understood, at least impressionistically, aspects of the wider world. Now, his narrative of that world was shaped by Muslim Brotherhood and related doctrine and the texts of Qutb and others. But it's not as if he was isolated. It's not as if he had turned his back on it. He was in the midst of it. In fact, his family challenged him every day with narratives. And he sat himself and watched Bonanza and American television in his very middle class, very familiar, comfortable Jeddah home. And he drove a white Mercedes at one point, and I think a Chevrolet at another point.
too fast, crashed the car, played soccer with his friends. So his world was a blend of all of these characteristics. Now, we know that after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, many young men of his generation were fired by the cause of resistance and revolt and revolution. The Iranian Revolution, though from the Shia sect, was nonetheless a powerful example of how people of faith could change broken politics in their own countries. The Soviet invasion was an international cause. These were young men. Their teachers were fired up. Some of their teachers were themselves under death sentence and exile, and so they had a sense of urgency about their own circumstance, which they imparted to their students. And so going to volunteer in Afghanistan, again, was not a radical thing that Osama did. It was an entirely normal thing. Many kids of his generation in the Gulf went out there for short visits, and it was often something you do. You go around and shoot guns for a couple of weeks and come back and tell your schoolmates, you know, how close you came to death and impress your friends. And there was a way in which the Afghans hosted these kind of tour groups of Saudi volunteers because it was a way to get in contact with people who could donate money to the real war that they were fighting 365 days a year. So they were happy to kind of accommodate temporary volunteers and give them a taste of the action, shoot at that hillside, and okay, let's go back to Peshawar now. And by the way, can I have your, you know, can I, if you, it would be a righteous thing to give me $20,000. And that was more or less the pattern in which Osama arrived. Now, as the Saudi government became more and more involved in the Afghan war, then Osama developed from something more than just a volunteer into an even more orthodox role. He was essentially the Bin Laden family company's representative to the Afghan war on behalf of the Saudi government. He brought bulldozers in to build facilities along the border to help the Mujahideen. He facilitated the arrival of other volunteers. He represented the Bin Ladens in private contracts with the Saudi intelligence service and the Saudi government in order to support the Afghans fighting along the border. Again, think of this from Salam's point of view. He's running this big, diverse company. It's got contracts in Canada. It's got contracts in Sweden. It's got contracts in the States. He's back and forth to Disney World. And oh yes, the Saudi government wants us to be fighting this war. So my brother Osama is the perfect brother for that project. He speaks their language. This is his war. And he's going to do us well, and he's going to protect our right flank in both cultural terms. And then in business, he's developing business. It's all good for me. Builds my credibility with the Saudi royal family. And when I started out on this project, I thought in the generation that I'm describing that I would see juxtaposition, that there were certainly secular Bin Ladens and there were more religious Bin Ladens, and I thought it would be interesting to try to weave them together and understand their lives in parallel. But I didn't expect to find what I did find, which was that, first of all, the extreme version of Salam and the extreme version of Osama running in parallel to one another, but not just in parallel. It turns out that they collaborated quite closely during the 1980s. Because, as I say, Osama was an authorized project. Osama was not a radical. He was an extension of Saudi foreign policy. He was an extension of Bin Laden business policy. So from Salam's point of view, anything that the Saudi royal family wants is good. And this is a project that the United States, which he was much more aligned with culturally, is also involved in through the CIA. So why not? Let's go all in. So what was the nature of Osama's collaboration with Salam? I'd always wondered what Americans Osama had ever met, because during Ghost Wars I was unable to document direct contact between Osama and any intelligence officers from the United States because the Americans didn't work directly on the frontier. They worked through the Pakistani intelligence service. In policy terms, it was probably a distinction without a difference, but as a curiosity, it was interesting that Osama had not had a lot of interactions with Westerners during the war. But while I was working on this other subject of his relationship with Salam, I came across a hunting and ballooning and ultralight flying expedition that Salam had mounted in Pakistan in the mid-1980s. One day in San Antonio, Texas, he walked into a store that sold ultralight aircraft, these light, sort of small aircraft you can fly with basically like a bicycle motor, you know, motorbike. And he bought out all the inventory that they had in the store, everything, had it shipped out to the airport and loaded onto his Bach 111. And as he was writing the check for $60,000 or something, he essentially turned around and the store manager said, oh, yeah, I'm going hunting in Pakistan with some Saudi princes, and we're going to fly these things around as part of what we do for fun, and I'm bringing some hot air balloons and some campers and some other things, but I need someone to to manage the ultralight part of the journey. Is there anyone here who'd like to come along? So they turned to this salesman in the store named George Harrington and said, George, would you like to make this trip? And he'd never been out of the country before, and he was an adventurous guy. He said, sure. So he goes out to the airport, gets on the Bach 111, flies to London, ends up at a ski resort in Austria on New Year's Eve playing House of the Rising Sun with Salam and Adnan Khashoggi's discotheque. Goes down to Cairo, goes over to the Gulf, starts hot air ballooning around the Persian Gulf, accidentally flies over some of Amir's palace, gets shot at by guards, ends up on the ground. Finally, they all pile into Salam's plane. They fly into Pakistan. They try to unload these balloons and ultralights. The Pakistanis say, are you out of your mind? You're not flying around here. We're fighting a war against the Soviets. Sends all the toys back, but they still go out in the campers to camp. And one morning, they're back in Karachi at the hotel, and Salam goes into George's hotel room and says, oh, we got to fly up to Peshawar today. I got to deal with my brother. So they get in one of Salam's private planes, they fly up to Peshawar on the Afghan border, they land on a dirt airstrip, and there's Osama out there. And not only is he there with this ultralight salesman, but he's brought along his favorite chain-smoking, long-haired Swedish mechanic who also played bass in some of the bands. And they all meet Osama, and they sit down and they have lunch and they talk. And this was typical of Osama's interactions with the West. They were basically people that Salam introduced to him who were accidental tourists in the entourage that Salam flew around the world with. But they also collaborated, and Salam was there to provide money to Osama. He had a video camera, documented Osama's activities, used that for fundraising in Saudi Arabia. And at a certain stage, he got even more serious because Osama contacted Salam and said that he wanted missiles because the Americans were supplying Stingers to the Afghans and the Arabs didn't get any of that. Salam arranged for Osama to fly to London, put him up in a hotel, and through one of his German pilot friends, found his way to some German arms dealers who were willing to sell Osama Soviet-made shoulder ground-to-air missiles. And they had a meeting where they put Osama in one room of this two-room suite on Park Lane in London. And the German friend of Salam's is going into the meeting, and Salam says, oh, yeah, with the arms dealers to work out the arrangements. And Salam says, oh, I forgot to tell you, my brother, he's really, really, really religious. So, you know, no jokes, treat me like a sheikh, and put your cigarettes out, we'll be out of here in 45 minutes. So that was the environment in which they did these arms transactions, and that was the nature of their collaboration. Now, in May of 1988, Salam was in Texas attending the wedding of one of his pilot's sons, and on a Sunday morning when he had nothing to do, he went out to an ultralight park outside of San Antonio called the Kitty Hawk Field of Dreams. And on a clear day, he got into one of these ultralights and he went up about 100 feet, started flying out just for fun, and inexplicably, because he was an incredibly skilled and experienced pilot at this point, he flew into some power lines and tilted and fell to the earth and died instantly. And afterwards, many of his brothers feared that because of the whole Afghan pipeline and the end of the Afghan war and the CIA's involvement, that somehow the Americans had killed Salam. They even sent some brothers to investigate the autopsy reports and the other things. And I think many of the brothers concluded that it was in fact an accident, but it was an accident without an explanation. I mean, it was a very difficult accident to understand. I've spent a lot of time working on it. I've concluded that it is an accident, but I can understand readily why those brothers in their circumstances, with their lens on the United States, would think it wasn't an accident, because it was a freak event. And so immediately after Salam's disappearance, leadership of the family really starts to drift. And perhaps it's a coincidence, perhaps not. Unless Osama is willing to come and sit down for the kinds of interviews that I would really like to conduct with him about his personal history, we'll never fully know. But some 3 months later, after Salam's death, Al-Qaeda was created. And Osama, in the aftermath of Salam's departure, decided to assert his own leadership over his own vision and his own idea of what the Bin Laden family should mean, how it should interact with Saudi Arabia, what its relationship with the royal family should be, what its aspirations as a family should be, and I can come back to this in question time. But the path of radicalization and departure from orthodoxy. If I've described Osama successfully at this point, I've described him as a creature of a global family and a very orthodox figure in Saudi terms. But after Salam's death, he does become radical. He starts to go to war with his own family, with his own kingdom, with his own inheritance, and with the United States. And as that develops, this departure is, I think, possible only because of the void of leadership that Saddam's death creates in the family. In fact, many, many people who I interviewed while working on this material said to me spontaneously, before I could even harbor the thought, oh, if Saddam hadn't died, 9/11 would never have happened. And I would say, well, why? Why do you say that? Well, Saddam, we all knew Saddam. Saddam, at the point when Osama went off the reservation, if he ever did go off the reservation while Saddam was around, he would have simply gone over to Sudan and bundled him up in a burlap sack and taken it back to Saudi Arabia, done whatever was necessary. He would not have allowed the situation to drift. He certainly would not have allowed Osama to put the family's interests or even American interests into jeopardy. That was a conviction that many, not just American, but Arabian friends of Saddam possessed. So I'll just conclude and turn to your questions by making a couple of observations about Osama and Al-Qaeda and answer a question that I started out with when I began this research, which took me sort of 3 years and travels to many, many different places, which was, I sort of wondered after working on Osama as a creature of the international Islamic radical movements and as a creature of the Afghan wars, in what way, in what meaningful way, is Osama a member of his own family? Because I think we can ask that about any of us. In what way am I a member of my own family? Well, not in every way, presumably, but in some important ways, yes. And it's a very complicated and rich question, and it's been hidden from us because the Bin Ladens are generally not available to us as a subject. And I concluded after all of my work, which is itself just a down payment on work that others I hope will follow and complete, that there are several important answers to that question that should shape our understanding not only of Osama today, but of the movement he leads. One is that he succeeded uniquely as a terrorist and as a militia leader and as a movement leader because of his ability to lead diversity. And this was something that he very much took from his father. As a young man, he would have seen his father's management of people from all over the world, his ability to muster. There was never discrimination on the basis of language, race, ethnicity in his father's world. That was a very un-Saudi characteristic, by the way. And there was never any of that really in Al-Qaeda. Quite remarkable. I mean, the Egyptians who came out were themselves quite intolerant and very sort of provincial in the way that they organized themselves. But Osama succeeded in creating a big tent because he had this intuition about the wider world and the people of faith who made that world true to God's plan. I mean, what is the Hajj, after all, but a gathering of Islamic diversity? And their family had the sole rights to build and renovate in Mecca, and they were the most prestigious hosts outside of the royal family at the annual Hajj. So this vision of a wider world united in faith and united in religious purpose, but comfortable in its diversity and not insisting on killing every apostate or every different member was very much a part of Osama's leadership and a part of his success. A second element is his rich, intuitive understanding. It's not just his comfort with, but his creative use of the technologies of globalization. The satellite television, the satellite telephone, the airplane, unifying those instruments to cross borders and strike at targets that would be unreachable without innovative use of those technologies. Now, he didn't just think that up, as you can now understand. This was bred into his understanding of how the world was shaped, how it operated, where geography could be traversed, how it could be changed. And Osama, it wasn't just on 9/11 that he demonstrated his innovation. After all, the initial terrorist attacks in the summer of 1998 against U.S. embassies in Africa were conducted by satellite telephone, which was purchased on Long Island by one of his colleagues. And then he made the calls from inside Afghanistan to a cell that was in place largely in Kenya. So this use of technology to innovate is also present in his use of the media. He was making, with Saddam walking around with that big clunky handheld camera, viral fundraising videos of a YouTube style, literally 15, 16 years before YouTube was invented. And then finally, the other characteristic that I think should shape our understanding of his strength and of Al-Qaeda's strength is that he was from a business family. And he was a junior executive in this family, and part of what the Bin Ladens did in Saudi Arabia was essentially market other brands into the kingdom. So brand management, brand extension, brand interpretation this is a Bin Laden business. I mean, it is today. And what is Al-Qaeda, among other things, but a brand that he very carefully built up and positioned and kept track of and repositioned as necessary. And his eldest son, Abdullah, who left him in Sudan when he was about 21 because he didn't want to live in exile with his father anymore, went back to Saudi Arabia because his cousins all had jet skis and Harleys and he wanted a piece of their lifestyle. He's there today, and when I was doing the research for this book in Jeddah, I went to his business. When he wasn't there, I met some people who worked for him, and they said, look, he's not going to need you, but you can come in after hours and get a feel for what he does. So his business is on Palestine Street next to a Starbucks and next to a yogurt place and next to a weightlifting gym. And it was on the top of a strip mall. And I went inside, and it's called Fame Advertising. And so Osama Bin Laden's eldest son today runs a business that markets brands for Western companies in Saudi Arabia. And I picked up some of his brochures, and in describing his own strengths, he said, the thing we do better than anyone else is spectacular events. Thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take questions that you